Here is what we know. The United States Navy, operating under direct presidential authorization, imposed a naval blockade of Iranian ports on April 13th. The stated objective was straightforward: interdict the flow of Iranian crude oil, apply maximum economic pressure on Tehran, and force the nuclear and military concessions that 2 years of diplomatic engagement had failed to produce. Within 20 minutes of that blockade taking effect, a Chinese-owned tanker called the MV Rich Starry, flying a Malawian flag, its AIS transponder having spoofed its position for 11 consecutive days, slipped through the restriction zone carrying approximately 250,000 barrels of Iranian origin methanol. It was one of at least 8 vessels that passed through on day one alone. The Pentagon claimed the blockade held. The facts said otherwise. That single tanker tells you more about the structural nature of this crisis than any official briefing has, because the MV Rich Starry is not an anomaly. It is the visible tip of a shadow fleet architecture that China has been building and operating for years, specifically engineered to move Iranian crude oil under conditions of American interdiction through false flags, spoofed transponders, and ship-to-ship transfers conducted in the open ocean off the Malaysian coast, where Chinese customs records show zero Iranian imports, despite recorded Malaysian crude shipments running at 1.3 million barrels per day in 2025, more than double Malaysia's entire domestic production capacity. The evasion network that moves Iranian oil to Chinese refineries was not assembled in response to this blockade. It was built in anticipation of exactly this moment, funded by the economic relationship that defines the single most important bilateral energy partnership on Earth. China purchases between 80 and 91% of Iran's total crude oil exports. In 2025 alone, that figure ran to approximately 1.38 million barrels per day. A decade ago, Iran sold oil to more than 20 nations. Round after round of American sanctions compressed that buyer pool to one. That concentration did not create Iranian vulnerability to American pressure. It created Chinese leverage over Iranian behavior that the United States Fifth Fleet, regardless of how many carrier strike groups are operating in the Arabian Sea, cannot replicate through naval force projection. The phone call that matters most in the Strait of Hormuz crisis is not the one between Washington and Tehran. It is the one between Beijing and Tehran, and it is a call that America gave up the right to make years ago and cannot recover through warship deployments. That is the strategic reality that the second front of this crisis has just made operationally visible. And before I walk you through what that means for every calculation Washington is currently making, I want to lay out the 4 questions that define this analysis with the honesty that this moment demands. First, what is the Chinese naval presence in and around the Strait of Hormuz actually composed of? What are its real operational capabilities? And how do you read what Beijing is doing versus what Beijing is signaling? Second, what does a 2-front maritime confrontation, America blockading Iranian ports from one direction, while Chinese naval assets operate in the same operational theater from another, actually look like in terms of rules of engagement, escalation thresholds, and the specific scenarios where a miscalculation becomes a kinetic event between the world's 2 largest military powers? Third, why does China's leverage in this crisis have almost nothing to do with the warships it has deployed and everything to do with an economic relationship that Washington's own Iran sanctions policy created and handed to Beijing over 2 decades? And fourth, when you map the energy mathematics of a sustained Hormuz disruption against China's strategic reserves, its alternative supply relationships, and its demonstrated willingness to sustain Iranian oil purchases under conditions that American secondary sanctions were specifically designed to prevent, who actually holds the endurance advantage in a confrontation that is ultimately a test of which side can absorb economic pain longer. Stay with me because the answers to these questions define not just what happens in the next 72 hours, but the shape of global energy markets, alliance relationships, and the realistic limits of American naval power projection for the decade ahead. If this is the level of analysis you have been searching for, the kind that goes past the official statements and into the operational reality that determines outcomes, subscribe now and stay with me through this complete breakdown. Hit like, share this with anyone trying to understand what is genuinely at stake in these waters, and leave your assessment in the comments. I read every one of them. Now, let us work through this completely. The Chinese Naval Task Force currently operating in the Gulf of Aden and Western Indian Ocean Theatre is China's 48th escort fleet, dispatched from Qingdao on October 11th, 2025. Its composition is specific and worth understanding in detail because the specifics matter for the operational picture. The task force is built around the Type 052 DL destroyer Tangshan, the Type 054A frigate Daqing, and the comprehensive replenishment ship Taihu. The Taihu's presence is operationally significant because it is not a combat vessel. It is a logistics platform carrying fuel, ammunition storage, helicopter support capability, and the extended operational endurance infrastructure that transforms a short-range escort mission into a sustained blue water deployment. The 48th Fleet has been continuously deployed since arriving at China's Overseas Military Support Facility in Djibouti in early November 2025, operating across the Gulf of Aden and Somali Basin in what is officially designated an anti-piracy escort rotation. I want to be precise about what this force composition tells us and what it does not tell us, because the Western commentary around Chinese naval movements in this crisis has tended toward two equally distorted positions. The first position overstates Chinese military presence, depicting warships conducting offensive operations in the strait itself, when the operational reality is a task force positioned more than 1,500 nautical miles away at sustained transit speed. The second position understates the strategic significance of the deployment entirely, treating it as a routine anti-piracy mission that has nothing to do with the Hormuz confrontation. Both positions miss what is actually happening. The 48th Fleet is not in the Strait of Hormuz. No verified evidence from commercial satellite imagery or open source maritime tracking has placed Tangshan, Daqing or Taihu within the Persian Gulf approaches. What the task force represents is a positioned capability, a Chinese naval presence close enough to the crisis theatre to generate observable strategic pressure without crossing the operational threshold that would transform a positioning signal into a direct military confrontation with American naval forces. That distinction is deliberate. It is Beijing operating at exactly the level of ambiguity that maximizes its leverage while minimizing the risk of a kinetic engagement it has not chosen to initiate. The Maritime Security Belt 2026 joint naval exercises conducted by Russia, China, and Iran in the Strait of Hormuz in February of this year established the operational baseline for what Chinese and Russian naval assets are capable of executing in this geographic environment. Those exercises involved live fire components, drone integration targeting both air and sea threats, and electronic warfare simulations, all conducted in the operationally constrained waterway of the strait itself. The exercises were officially designated as counter-piracy and maritime security training. The operational content was considerably more specific than that framing suggests. The introduction of Chinese signals intelligence ships into the Gulf of Oman during those exercises created what one expert assessment described as the effective end of the era of American naval monopoly in the region. That assessment is contested in its framing, but the underlying operational point is real. China now has direct operational familiarity with the electromagnetic environment, the traffic patterns, and the tactical geography of the strait in a way that it did not possess 5 years ago. Now, consider what a genuine two-front maritime confrontation in this theatre actually looks like in operational terms, because the scenario is not theoretical at this point. It is the environment that American naval planners are working inside right now. The US naval blockade of Iranian ports established American control of the strait's exit and entry points from one direction. The Chinese naval presence in the Gulf of Aden, positioned at the western approach to the Arabian Sea, creates a second operational layer that any American escalation against Iranian shipping must account for simultaneously. The specific scenario that American operational planners are most concerned about is not a direct Chinese-American naval engagement. Neither side wants that, and both sides understand the consequences clearly enough to avoid it deliberately. The scenario that concerns them is the accidental or ambiguous engagement. A Chinese-flagged vessel that the US Navy cannot clearly identify as civilian or military, operating in waters where the Iranian shadow fleet is also active, presenting a targeting decision that has to be made under time pressure, with incomplete information in an electromagnetic environment where both sides are actively conducting signals, intelligence collection on each other's communications. That is the scenario where a tactical miscalculation between nuclear-armed states becomes possible, not through intent, but through the friction of simultaneous operations in a congested theatre, where the rules of engagement have not been negotiated, and the communication channels between American and Chinese naval commanders are less robust than the ones that existed between American and Soviet naval forces during the Cold War. Trump's demand in March that China help reopen the strait, issued publicly through what amounted to diplomatic pressure via announcement, produced a Chinese response that was calibrated to the same quality of precise ambiguity that defines Beijing's entire posture in this crisis. China stated that the war should not have started. It criticized Iran for attacking other countries in the area. It described the American naval blockade as dangerous and irresponsible, and it did not send warships into the strait in support of the American position, nor did it apply the economic pressure on Iran that Washington's demand implicitly requested. That response, simultaneously critical of both sides while committing to no operational role that could constrain Chinese freedom of action, is not a failure of Chinese diplomatic nerve. It is a precisely constructed position that preserves every option Beijing wants to preserve, while denying Washington the one thing it most needs, which is Chinese economic leverage over Tehran, applied in the direction that American strategic interests require. The reason Beijing's leverage works in this direction rather than Washington's direction traces directly to the economic architecture of the Iran-China relationship, and understanding that architecture is essential for understanding why this crisis cannot be resolved by American naval power alone, regardless of how many carrier strike groups are deployed. China's 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership with Iran, signed in 2021, embedded Beijing as the structural foundation of Iranian economic survival under sanctions. Oil exports fund approximately 45% of Iran's government budget. The International Monetary Fund assesses Iran's fiscal break-even oil price at between $121 and $124 per barrel. Chinese buyers pay approximately $60 per barrel after discount. Iran was running budget deficits before this crisis intensified. The rial had lost 15% of its value in a single month prior to the blockade. Tehran's economic position is genuinely stressed, and the stress runs directly through the Chinese-purchase relationship. This creates a structural reality that Washington's Iran strategy has consistently failed to operationalize. China can, in theory, turn off the economic oxygen that sustains Iranian resistance to American demands through a simple decision to stop purchasing Iranian crude at the discounted rate that makes the relationship viable for Tehran. The United States has spent years trying to force that decision through secondary sanctions, threatening Chinese banks and shipping companies with American financial market exclusion if they continue processing Iranian oil transactions. The threat has produced evasion rather than compliance. Chinese customs records show zero Iranian oil imports since 2022, a figure that is technically accurate in the sense that the transactions are routed through Malaysian intermediary accounts and shadow fleet transfers that formally break the direct China-Iran commercial chain. The oil still moves. The evasion infrastructure that moves it has become more sophisticated with each successive round of American pressure. Secondary sanctions can raise the cost of the evasion. They have not been able to raise it above the point where Beijing has concluded that the cost of stopping the trade exceeds the strategic value of maintaining it. What makes the current moment different from previous rounds of American-Chinese friction over Iranian oil is the directness of the confrontation in the strait itself. The MV Rich Starry incident, a Chinese-owned sanctioned vessel successfully transiting the American blockade zone on the first day of enforcement before eventually complying with US Navy instructions to return, established the operational template for how this confrontation plays out at the tactical level. American naval forces can hail, shadow, and in extreme cases board vessels in the blockade zone. They cannot, under current rules of engagement and given the political constraints of a simultaneous confrontation with Iran, systematically intercept Chinese-connected shipping without triggering a Chinese response that transforms a bilateral Iran crisis into a direct Sino-American confrontation. Beijing understands this constraint precisely. Its public description of the American blockade as dangerous and irresponsible, while simultaneously sending its foreign minister to coordinate with Russian counterparts and maintaining its energy purchase relationship with Tehran, is the behavior of a government that has correctly identified the limits of what American naval pressure can achieve when the country that has the economic leverage to make that pressure decisive has chosen not to exercise it in Washington's favor. There is a dimension of this situation that I find most operationally significant and that has received the least serious analytical attention in the coverage I have seen. It is the energy endurance calculation. How long can each side sustain its current position before the economic and political costs become unmanageable? And when you run that calculation honestly, the answer is not what Washington's public posture suggests. China imported approximately 40% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz before this crisis. It holds approximately 1 billion barrels in strategic petroleum reserves, representing several months of supply at current consumption rates, that has been systematically diversifying its crude import sources through the Belt and Road infrastructure investments of the past decade, with pipeline connections to Central Asian producers and deepened purchase relationships with Russian, African, and South American suppliers. A Hormuz disruption of weeks or even months imposes genuine costs on Chinese industrial production and domestic energy security. It does not impose existential costs on a government that has been energy security. It does not impose existential costs on a government that has been explicitly preparing for American economic pressure scenarios for years, and that has the reserve depth to sustain current operations while alternative supply arrangements are expanded. Compare that with the position of American allies and the broader global economy. Japan, South Korea, India, and every major European economy depend on continued Hormuz transit for energy security in ways that cannot be rapidly restructured through strategic reserve releases or alternative supply sourcing at the volumes required. Oil prices have already surged. Every day the blockade holds and the counter-blockade that Iran has deployed through its own port closure declarations deepens the economic pressure on American partners, intensifies in ways that Washington's domestic political calculations were not designed to absorb indefinitely. The energy market mathematics of a sustained Hormuz closure are not primarily a problem for China. They are primarily a problem for the alliance system that American Middle East strategy depends on, the system whose members Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the major European partners have already demonstrated through their public statements on reopening the strait that they are unwilling to send their own naval assets into the operational environment that has produced this confrontation. When Moscow looks at this picture, the satisfaction is genuine and strategically grounded. Russia's energy revenues climb with every day that Hormuz disruption keeps global oil prices elevated. The tension and resources that Washington is committing to the dual-front maritime crisis in the Strait is attention and resources that are not available for the European theatre where Russia's strategic interests are directly engaged. The Maritime Security Belt 2026 exercises that brought Russian, Chinese and Iranian naval forces into coordinated operations in the Strait in February provided Moscow with operational visibility into the theatre that its own forces are not currently operating in, but that Russian military planners are tracking with close professional interest. The Russian calculation in this crisis, as in every preceding phase of the broader conflict it has emerged from, is to maximize the costs that American escalation imposes on American allies while minimizing Russian direct exposure to those costs. That calculation is executing precisely as designed. The international response pattern that has emerged around the Strait reopening question illustrates the structural problem facing Washington with a clarity that the official diplomatic framing consistently obscures. Trump demanded in March that NATO members and China help the United States reopen the Strait. What he received was a joint statement from France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Japan, and eventually a coalition of additional partners, including Australia, South Korea, and the Gulf states expressing readiness to participate in efforts to reopen the Strait. That statement is not the same as a commitment to deploy naval forces into the operational environment that produced this crisis. Japan's Prime Minister explicitly ruled out current plans to send Japanese naval ships. Australia's government said it would not send ships to the Strait. The European Union failed to reach agreement on expanding its naval missions to cover Hormuz. The gap between statement and operational commitment is the gap between what American alliance management has produced in 30 years of investment and what it can actually deliver when the cost of delivering it is operational exposure to the same threat environment that has already demonstrated it can defeat American naval assets. My assessment of where this leads, and I am going to state it as directly as professional responsibility permits, is that the two-front maritime confrontation that the United States is currently managing in the Strait of Hormuz has exposed a structural mismatch between American strategic objectives and American strategic tools that no repositioning of carrier strike groups can correct. The blockade is a pressure instrument designed to force Iranian compliance with demands that Iran has structured its entire strategic posture to resist absorbing. The Chinese economic relationship with Tehran is the safety valve that allows Iran to resist those demands for longer than American domestic political attention spans, typically sustain maximum pressure campaigns. The naval confrontation with Chinese connected shipping in the blockade zone is the escalation risk that caps how far American enforcement can go before the cost of enforcement exceeds the benefit of the pressure it is supposed to generate. What this crisis is ultimately demonstrating is the consequence of 2 decades of American Iran policy that simultaneously excluded Washington from the economic relationships that constitute real leverage over Tehran, while constructing a sanctions architecture that successfully transferred that leverage to Beijing. Secondary sanctions raised the cost of Chinese engagement with Iranian oil. They did not raise it above the strategic value China assigns to maintaining the relationship, and the Iran-China economic architecture that resulted from that failure now sits at the center of the Hormuz confrontation as the single most important variable that American naval power cannot address. Every warship in the Strait is there to make a phone line ring, the one between Beijing and Tehran. The Fifth Fleet cannot make that call. No adjustment in American naval force posture changes the fact that Iran's economy runs on Chinese demand and that Beijing has chosen to sustain that demand on terms that serve Chinese strategics interests rather than American strategic requirements. The question I want to leave you with is this: if China's leverage over Iran is the decisive variable in how this Hormuz crisis resolves, and if 2 decades of American sanctions policy have transferred that leverage to Beijing while simultaneously eliminating Washington's own economic tools for applying it, what does a resolution that serves American strategic interests actually look like? And is the instrument that produces that resolution a carrier strike group in the Arabian Sea, or is it a diplomatic framework that gives China an economic and strategic reason to apply its leverage in a direction that American interests require? Because from where I sit looking at the operational and economic picture, as honestly as I can, the answer to that question has not changed since day one of this confrontation. The Strait does not close or open based on what American warships do. It closes or opens based on a phone call that only Beijing can make to a government that only Beijing has the leverage to move, on terms that Washington has spent 20 years making it structurally irrational for Beijing to accept. That is the two-front crisis in its most essential form, and neither front is the one the carrier groups are sailing toward. Tell me what you think. Leave your assessment in the comments. I read every response and they sharpen my own analysis. If this breakdown delivered the depth and honesty this moment demands, share it, hit like and subscribe. The next update is already in preparation.